Hello everyone in the VC, it's Matt, and I thought I would do another Beach Boy album review since I've been doing those in order of release. And with that, we are up to their, hey, their 1969 effort, 2020, which came out in February 10th of that year. Here's my copy. It's got a little bit of a glare on there, it looks like. Sorry about that. Here's the back. And this is actually a re-release that I got not too long ago. It's kind of funny. I don't know that you're going to be able to read that, but it says originally released in 1964 by Capitol Records. I'm not sure where that came from because it was released 5 years after 1964, but just noticed that today. Thought it was kind of funny. The other thing you might notice is the group shot here does not include Brian Wilson on the front nor the back, which kind of might be a little symbolic or plays into the theme of the album somewhat. But there is a gatefold, and if you open it, he is there with an eye chart, kind of a play on the 2020. It's got a little bit of an awkward album because there is where the album goes, and you can see it's kind of neat that the eye chart goes down inside the album, but it makes it kind of a challenge to get the album in and out. 2020 also refers to the fact that this was the band's 20th album, if you count compilations and studio albums. So, by this time, as I've said over my last several reviews, past about 1966 or 67, the Beach Boys were basically persona non grata in the U.S. at least. People just had lost interest. They were has-beens and just didn't want to know, which is unfortunate because they were releasing some really incredible albums and some great music during this time period. So people in the U.S. were missing out, but they didn't seem to care. And a lot of these albums, the songs that still show up on the oldies radio, kind of tend to. There's a couple of exceptions, but pretty much tend to stop after 66 or so, and that's a shame because a lot of the songs on these albums you never hear on the radio. I'm not sure if they even got played back when these albums were released, and it's too bad because there's some really great stuff. Anyway, this did a little bit better than the album before it, Friends. This actually made it all the way up to number 68 on the U.S. chart. Did substantially better in England, and deservedly so. It made it to number 3 over there. And this is just a great album. I was not familiar with this, with the exception of a couple of songs, which we'll get to, which were still get some radio play and were hits. This album had really the band's last top. Well, it had didn't really have it. It had the band's last top 40 single until 1976, and another song on here we'll get to, which didn't make the top 40 but got some radio play and still does. I was not familiar with the rest of the songs on this album, so I have played it several times over the last few weeks to familiarize myself with them. This is the 4th album in a row that Brian Wilson did not produce, or at least he didn't solely produce it. He had a hand in the production, but the rest of the band shared production chores on this, as they had for the last 3 before it. It's also their last album on Capitol Records. The band would re-sign with Capitol years later, but they'd been with Capitol really since the get-go. I mean, their initial 45 was on Candic's label, which was later re-released on Capitol, but other than that, they'd always been with Capitol. So this is their goodbye to Capitol. Wade had they and the label kind of weren't getting along too well at this point, unfortunately. And there's a song on here, so song 45 called Breakaway, which was released around this time, which is not on this album. Incredible, wonderful. It's a 10. It should have been a #1 song. Look that up on YouTube sometime. It was released later on compilation albums, so it was never released on a studio album. So Breakaway is definitely worth Carl Sings, and it's just a great, catchy pop rock and roll, soaring, beautiful little piece of music there. So definitely go to YouTube and check that out. But Brian, like I said, was not present for most of the recording, or for much of the recording of this album, he had checked himself into a hospital for a while because of depression and mental and drug problems, so he wasn't having a great time. This is kind of considered a cobbled together album in many respects because the other band members, they wrote songs to contribute to this, but as far as the Brian songs, a lot of these, Dennis and Carl went and found some demos from several years earlier that Brian had done and sort of brushed them off and spruced them up and re-recorded them. There's a couple of songs, might be more than two, but there's one or two songs that Brian did write during this time frame for this album, and he does show up with vocals and to probably play bass or piano a little bit on this album, but for much of the recording he was absent, and that may be why he's not on the cover and is in here instead. I don't know, but yeah, so this couple of the singles, there's several singles were released from this album, but a couple of them were actually released about 6 months before the album came out. We'll get to that later. Anyway, let's just go through the songs. Side one is the hit, the one that still gets played on the radio quite a bit nowadays, called "Do It Again." I'm sure you've all heard it. It was got to number 20 in the U.S., which is not very good. So, like I said, it was our last top 40 single until their cover of Rock and Roll Music in 1976. Even though they released some really good singles in between that time, they just didn't chart because the Beach Boys, again, were just considered out of date and has been, and that's a shame. But Do It Again kind of harkens back to their earlier surf and hot rod sound that they pretty much abandoned by the end of '64. So it's a little bit of nostalgia for their '64 sound here in 1969, but it works. It's a catchy song. I love the intro. That's that sort of I don't know if it's a synthesizer, but it's sort of that weird drum sound at the beginning. It's got some really good harmonies. It's a great song. The album version, not the 45, the album version, at the end, there's some people working with tools, with hammers and saws. That's something called Workshop, which was a little snippet of something on the album Smile, which of course was never released until, what was it, 2011. Was not released in 1967 as originally intended, but that's just a little snippet of Smile that's dog-ended onto the tail end of Do It Again on the album, not the single. Got to number one in England, so they obviously, seems like England has better music taste than the U.S. a lot of times, but great song. I'm going to give it a 9, and of course you've all heard the song, so probably don't talk about it too much. There was a promo video shot for it with them running around in a van and going to the beach and surfing. They were going to do a second promo, which was supposed to have Paul McCartney playing a store clerk, and I guess he was all for it, but they just couldn't work out schedules to get together, so it never got made, which is unfortunate. Second song on side one is another one that also still shows up on the radio, and this is really probably about the last of their songs that still show up on the radio, unfortunately, not counting things like Kokomo and Sail On Sailor, and 73 got some airplay. But I Can Hear Music, which is a cover that was done by the Ronettes, I think, I want to say like 64, 65. The song was written by Jeff Barry, Ellie Greenwich, and Phil Spector. Ronettes' version's really good. The Beach Boys, Carl sings. It's just a good version. I think kind of like the Ronettes version a little bit better, but the Beach Boys do a good version of it. I'm going to give that one an 8. I think, did I say I got 9 on Do It Again is what I went. This had been released earlier on 45, and it got to number 24. So, and Do It Again got to 20, did a little bit better. That was after that. Number 3 is another cover version by some guy named Ursel Hickey. Was released like in, his version was from 1950. I should have written that down. It was in the 50s, 50 or 54. And I need to go to YouTube just to hear his version. I should have done that before I did the review here, but kind of interested to see what he does, how he does with it. Anyway, Bluebirds Over the Mountain. Mike Love sings lead on that with Carl and Bruce Johnson on the background. It's got a really good hard rock guitar, probably the hardest rock guitar, or at least up to this point. There's still quite a few of the albums in the 70s and 80s I haven't heard, but up to this point, the the hardest guitar on any Beach Boys album or song. I give it a 8 because of that guitar mainly. The song itself is bounces along nicely and it's okay. It's nothing great, but it is pretty good and it's enjoyable. So I give it an 8. So now we get into number 4 on side 1, which is called "Be With Me." Dennis Wilson wrote it and sings it with his typical, very tender and fragile vocals, which work great on his songs. I think I'd said on the Friends album review how he was kind of the Chase the Girls, Party Party, Hellraiser of the band. And so it came as a surprise to everybody when he started writing songs. They expected them to be very, I don't know, rock and roll or juvenile or silly or something, and his songs are actually very poetic and touching, and that surprised Brian and everyone else in the band, and probably the fans of the band, that, you know, under the wild, crazy surface, there was a poet down there, so who knew? But very nice orchestration, the great vocals, the ba 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 ba. I can't sing, but the kind of ascending ba 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 chorus there a couple of times just gets you every time. And just song just soars. It's you know, "Be With Me," "Set Me Free," singing to some girl I'm imagining. Song gets a 10. It's really great. It's just very very affecting and beautiful song. It's great. Give that a 10. So now we go to number 5, which is called "All I Want to Do," which is another song written by Dennis. Very good song it is. Mike Love sings this time though, which for Mike it's a very gruff and rough kind of driving rock and roll vocal, and which you don't hear from him all that often, or not to this degree at least. You do hear it in some of the earlier songs, but does a really good job vocally. So can't say I never said anything good about Mike Love, but that may be the only thing good I ever say about him. But it's just it's idea is, I don't care where we go, I just want to be with you. I don't care what you do, just want you to do it with me, which might be where Prince got the idea for Take Me With You 20 years later. Who knows? I doubt it. But the song is upbeat rock and roll, kind of hard rock, more hard rock than usual for the Beach Boys. That's the thing about some of these songs on the album, that were not the radio hits. You could play them for people, and I don't think a lot of people would be surprised to learn that this is the Beach Boys, because some of this stuff doesn't really sound like them, but it sounds really great. Musically, song kind of reminds me of "Shake Your Tail Feather," the Ray Charles song. Remember that part in the Blues Brothers when they're in the music store trying to get instruments? A little bit. Great song. I give that one a 10. Number 6 is the last song on side 1. It's called "The Nearest Faraway Place," which is an instrumental written by Bruce Johnston. Very lush song, very longing, very new agey in parts, which I usually, new age music is dull and boring and have no interest in it, but here it works, and so it's good. It's kind of evokes in me like you're thinking about old memories, good memories. So it's sort of tinged with bittersweetness, thinking about the old days that are no longer around. Of course, it's an instrumental, so I guess you can project whatever impressions or thoughts onto it you want to, but kind of ahead of its time. Sounds like something, instead of 60s music, it sounds like something that might have come out in the 70s or 80s. So nice for an instrumental. It's really good. Kind of evocative of some of the instrumentals on Pet Sounds a little bit, or somewhat. Anyway, it's good. I give it a 9. So now we go to side 2, and first song on that is "Cotton Fields," which is a song from 1940, was written by Huddy Ledbetter, better known to most of you as Leadbelly, the old blues guy. Um, well, Johnston had the idea that since Sloop John B on Pet Sounds was a hit single and did really well, and that was an old song from old folk song from like the 30s, 40s, and a million people had done it before. And of course, the Beach Boys version is really well known, might be the best known version of the song out there. But he thought, since that worked on Sloop John B, it might work with another old song, and let's do it with Cotton Fields. This would be released as a single, would be their final single on Capitol Records. Uh, so yeah, it's also their last record and last single in mono. Pretty good cover version. I've heard Lead Bellies before, and it's really good in a totally different way. But um, you know, I think Sloop John B was a little bit better than this, but I like it. I'll give this one a 7.5. That was pleasant. Okay, so now we get to song 2 on side 2, which is I Went to Sleep, which Brian and Carl wrote and sing. Very good song. I give it a 9.5. It's very old-timey sounding song, kind of old European type music, and good vocals, and just a neat song. 9.5 on that. Third song on side 2 is Time to Get Alone, which Brian wrote and Carl sings. The song is a waltz, in waltz time the music is, which is kind of neat, goes back and forth, sort of a waltz music. This Brian originally planned to give this to a band called, what were they called? Redwood, right? Hold on. Yeah, Redwood, which probably means nothing to you all, but Redwood would go on to become Three Dog Night, and the song Darling from Wild Honey. But the band heard it and said, hey, those songs are good, don't give them to someone else, give them to the band, which he ended up doing. So, and the idea lyrically is just a boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, uh, just to get alone together, get alone from society, get alone from people, and just spend time together. Uh, Neat song. Love the music. I'm going to give that a 9.5. Number 4, this is where it gets a little strange, and Never Learn Not to Love, which was written by Dennis Wilson and Charles Manson. So, even though Manson is not credited on the album, the actually Manson had written songs before he decided that, you know, leading a hippie cult and killing people was more of his calling, and the song was called Cease to Exist, which he apparently gave to Dennis to use for the band, and then Dennis changed the lyrics around in the title, and Manson's version is supposed to be more blues based. I haven't heard that. This is more pop and rock. Manson was apparently not happy about this, and Dennis Wilson went on his hit list, but fortunately he didn't get to him before he got arrested. So what's Charles Manson doing on the Beach Boys album? Well, he's not on it. He doesn't play on the song. Dennis was out driving around and saw some girls hitchhiking. I guess this was back in late 67, 68. And Dennis being Dennis, he stops to pick the girls up and takes them to their house and hangs out with them. And then they take them back to where they live, which was with Charles Manson, who hadn't killed people yet, so they didn't know who this was going to be. But unfortunately, he makes the mistake of sort of befriending him and hanging around him, and it's yeah, kind of strange. So this is probably the darkest and most menacing that the Beach Boys song ever got, and yet for all that, because Manson, when he was on trial, released an album, I think in 1970 or so, of his songs. I've never played it because, I mean, you know, it, you can forgive your pop stars for a lot of their faults, but there's a certain line, and I don't really want to listen to Charles Manson music. Uh, but Never Learn Not to Love is kind of dark, but kind of bouncy and catchy. I'll give it that, and it's actually a pretty good song. And how much of this was Manson's lyrics and how much of it was Dennis, I'm not sure, but um, it's um, it's not a bad song. So I like it. I'm going to give it a 9. It's just unfortunate the derivation of it, but yeah, I don't know. It's not a bad song. Um, anyway, Dennis would also unfortunately introduce Manson to other people in the music industry. Terry Melcher, a producer, and some other people like that. And this again was all before the whole Sharon Tate and the other people, LaBianca murders. Uh, so some of the people in the music industry apparently were interested in recording or signing Manson. Uh, Strange times the '60s were. Uh, so then the fifth song on side 2 is Our Prayer, which is one of the songs that was left over from Smile, the unreleased Smile. A lot of the Smile album, a lot of Smile songs would get released, parsed out on different albums over the next few years. But Our Prayer is the a cappella thing that when Smile was finally released in 2011, it's the first song on the album, kind of the introduction, the a cappella of just them singing, uh, no instrumentation, just a uplifting, kind of celestial, heavenly um, choir type thing. Very good. It worked. It's funny because some of the Smile songs that are stuck on these albums after uh, Pet Sounds kind of seemed like they were just put there because they had them and they seemed kind of out of place. Our Prayer actually works really well in the context of this album, maybe because this album was a lot of just songs they had lying around and wasn't really a planned, cohesive album the way that Pet Sounds and Smiley Smile and even things like Wild Honey and Friends seem to be. But it works really well. And then the last song on the album, sixth song on side 2, Our Prayer gets a 10, by the way, and I'd kind of talked about that in my Smile review. Uh, Cabin Essence is the last song on the album. It's another Smile left over. This one has vocals. This is Brian and Van Dyke Parks wrote it. Carl sings lead with Mike backing him. Just a beautiful, uplifting, really good song. One of the highlights is the Smile album, and that gets a 10. So this album, um, I'm going to go. I was just watching a video of Mean Mr. Mayo. He was reviewing George Harrison album, and he said he wanted to give it a 10, but he went with a 9. Said he doesn't like to go with like point whatever, or he'd give it a 9.5. I don't have a problem with the points though, so I'm going to give this a 9.82. So there you go, Joe. That's anyway. This is definitely worth checking out because most people would know Do It Again and I Can Hear Music and would not be familiar with the rest of this. And this is really great album. Just got some hard rock stuff that doesn't sound like your typical Beach Boys. It's got some really uh, lush and beautiful and some ballads, some just catchy, great harmonies here and there, and just some great songs that should have been heard and should have got radio play and unfortunately didn't. But that's no excuse not to check this album out now because it's really good. And if I were to do a ranking of 1969 albums and I was not familiar with this album until, 3 or 4 weeks ago, this would be up there in the top 10, if not, you know, up in the top 5 maybe. But really good album. I don't know what the other Beach Boy fans think of it, but I like it. I say check it out. And we'll be back with some more Beach Boy reviews later. Fun.